And I believe we're live right now, but we're gonna have to wait till this thing pops up, and I'm gonna post it in my Facebook. Yeah, we're definitely live right now. So just 1 second. I'm gonna cut this off so it won't echo. All right. Do you see me?
I see you.
All
Real
right.
good.
Hold on 1 second. Let me post this in to let people know that we are live. Yes, I see this. Let me share this bad boy. All right. Now okay, we're live. So we have Dr. Bruce D. Haynes in the building, all the way from the Bay Area. As you see the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. I should have put in the Northern Lights background over here. But yeah, no, we have the author of The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America. I have the book. I've had it for a while. I'm glad, I'm humbled and delighted that we have him.
Thanks for having me.
Right. And I believe it's three around over past three, about 3:17 now in the afternoon
It is
there.
indeed.
Right. And
Exactly.
it's about 12:17 past midnight here in Oslo, Norway. But we're gonna do the thing still. So yeah, no,
Might be my first international interview, just so you know.
abs,
I don't
abs
think I've been interviewed
what?
way before.
I'm the first.
I think so. I think
That's what's
so.
up, man. Hey, I've been a pioneer on a few things. I actually interviewed man, because we're talking about uh Jews and matter of fact, let me grab the book. It's on my shelf. There we go. Hold on 1 second.
Sure.
When I send you the link after this interview to my YouTube channel, like I said, it's not so big, but I think I've done a few things that other channels probably haven't done. I interviewed this well, from what he told me, I was the first African American to interview him. I don't know if you heard of him. The
And
my I have a light on my yeah. It's Professor Benjamin Isaac.
nice.
He's
It's the kind of
he,
book I would have on my shelf, it looks like, actually.
exactly. He's one of the first that wrote in a book on proto racism and antiquity. Uh, yeah,
Interesting. You know, it's
and
funny. I may have to pick up that book. So that's a great book for.
no,
I've
no,
already gotten a tip from you already. So that's
right,
something I'm
right,
working on right
no,
now.
no doubt, no doubt. No, and there's let me grab one last one just to relate it because I'm going to hold up 1 second. There's another one I got on the shelf, and you might have heard of this lady, Rebecca Fudo Kennedy.
I
Ah,
do not know her.
okay. Well,
Race and ethnicity in the classical world.
right, and she has a lot of his. She referenced a lot of his work in this right here.
Interesting.
Right,
Those are both books that
and,
will aid me what I'm trying to write right now. So
right,
that's fascinating. That's great. You
right.
never know where your references are going to come from sometimes.
No doubt, no doubt. And you have to. I'm going to send you the link, and he's a retired professor at I think Tel Aviv University or something like that. And
Excellent.
he's you got to check out that interview, man. I'm gonna send it to you via email after this one right here.
Super.
So like I said, I gave you a brief about me, off air about how I started, about starting out trying to just find out about the African diaspora here in particularly African American at first, and then the rest of the Africans here on some of the just trying to bring light to some of the achievements and things of what they're doing out here, and then it kind of morphed into other things. As I'm in these Facebook groups and they have these different questions about God, and I'm also in tune with the so-called conscious community back home, and especially where are you from? In Harlem, New York.
Mm-hmm.
And where I came into your work was when I had saw the video when you did the interview on Dagger Squad with Garfield.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Garfield gave me a great interview. He
right,
really did.
right,
I
right,
really enjoyed that interview.
right. And that's where I believe that probably a lot of us that are in tune with the conscious community or woke uh, people, as we like to call ourselves, probably got into your work, or at least some of us, African Americans. And so, yeah, that through that is why I found out about you, and I ordered your book immediately, and have gone through it. Um, and yeah, no, in that interview was very interesting. Now he's a lot more versed at the. He's been studying the Jewish text a lot more than me. I can tell you that. So,
Okay.
um, but what I like about your book is, and also what he says, is that you have a more and also through your mouth you say you have a more sociological approach rather than just
Sure.
a historical approach. But anyway, I want to start out with saying yes. So you're the you're a professor of sociology at UC Davis. Um, you had your PhD in '95. You also were a assistant professor of sociology and African studies at Yale University. This pretty much the same year after you received a PhD in '95.
That was basically my first job out of the block, so to speak. Yes.
Got you. And 2001, you joined the faculty and your senior fellow in the urban ethnography project at Yale University. And your research focus is racialization of people in place. That the book in question, The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America, that I'm going to focus on tonight. I also won an award in the next year, 2019, and that's how do I pronounce that? Albert J. Roboto,
Roboto.
Roboto, the book prize for the best book in Africana religions, and also, as Garfield said, from the conscious community, that is his top 5 or top 10 must-read books for African Americans on his list. And I must say, I would agree. Uh,
Thank you.
far
Thank you.
far as
That's,
the
quite a
black
compliment.
definitely far as the black Jew question. So yeah, so pretty similar to what he said. How if you can give us some of your background and some of the things I know, there's a lot more selective publications that you've done that I haven't named all of them. Actually, I think I wrote down some. Um, the more recent ones, publications that you have written, racial categories and machine learning, understanding race with AI, and the other book that was published down the up staircase, Three Generations of a Harlem Family. And you have
Written with my Jewish co-author, by the way, my wife.
right. Got you. And there's several other publications and awards that I left out, I'm sure. Also, in your teach is are focused primarily on race and ethnic inequality, racialized spaces, ethnic communities, and urban society. Um, and like I said, I would like to see if you can start out with telling us some of your background there and
Sure, sure. Well,
who
let me
you
start.
are,
I
and
guess
yeah.
I'll start in the beginning. I kind of grew up a middle class kid in New York. Both my parents were social workers. My father was a parole officer, and my mother
Oh,
worked for the Department of Mental Hygiene, reviewing programs for the State Department of Mental Hygiene. And she had started her career as a social worker at Harlem Hospital back in the 50s. And so I come from a very much a social work family. And I grew up, I guess, in a very progressive environment. I got mugged in second grade in the bathroom and public school at PS 186 in Harlem, up on 145th Street.
mm, mm.
And it was the same year that the New York City school strike was taking place, 1968. So my mother decided that was the time to pull me out of public school and to put me downtown into private schools. So that's really when my life changed quite considerably, because up until this point, my life had been pretty much in an all Black environment. And now I'm going downtown to a very progressive private school. It has a Black principal. Think about that, 1969, a school that has white kids with a black principal is sort of
Yeah.
unheard of in
Yeah.
in the country.
Right.
The woman who was the principal happened to, her name was Alana Gaston, and she worked for the Children's Television Workshop, which is the group that created Sesame Street. And so
Okay.
she was a leading educator in her field, which is why she ended up principal of this little school. But that integrated me into this progressive Yorkville centered upper middle class Jewish world in New York City. And so I met kids. In fact, my very first friend there at that school was a kid named Jack Neff, who I still know to this day. Jack lives down in LA.
Okay.
So this was a new world, meeting white kids with long hair. And I'm 69, I have a big afro, and kids are saying,
Oh, wait, hold on. You're 6'9"? What'd you say?
No, it was 1969.
Oh, okay. My bad. Yeah.
And
1969.
I've got a big
I
afro.
was like, yeah.
No,
Got
I'm
you.
more like 4'9".
No.
Okay, 4'9" with a big afro. Okay, and
He lying. He ain't 4'9".
okay, and well, at that point in time, I was still 4'9".
Right.
And,
Got you.
And so I grew up going to these progressive, largely Jewish prep schools in New York.
Mm.
So I went from this school called the Emerson School, where Alana Gaston was a principal. And in 7th grade, I entered a little less progressive school, a more traditional prep school called the Dwight School.
Okay.
And again, it's that was a small school, maybe 250 kids in this school. So I'm in a class of 36 kids. And so this is kind of, the elite education in New York before it turned to what it is today, a competition about money and status and elite schools. The competition for money back in the 70s wasn't like it is today.
Right.
So it was largely a lot of middle class kids were there, a lot of kids whose parents were professionals but not wealthy, mixed in with kids who were living on Park Avenue, and parents were kind of nouveau riche amongst Jews in America. And they were progressives. They were lawyers, and I was invited to kids' country houses, and I was the kid who had parents that were still married, so that was a big deal because half the kids were getting divorced back in the 70s.
Right. That experience, I've heard you speak on that. Well, going back to when you said in 2nd grade, when you said that you had got mugged or robbed. Was it
was just like one of these deals.
Was it at school or after?
It was actually at school in the boys' room.
Gotcha.
But it was this was it's the 60s,
Right,
and I'm a little
right.
kid of literally I'm like all of 66 pounds probably when I'm in 1st or 2nd grade.
Did it have a profound effect on you? Traumatic experience?
No, it wasn't the kind of mugging that you see today. This was like a mugging 60s style, where a big kid said to a little kid, "Hey, let me see your watch." And I looked up at this kid. I'm like, "Okay, what are you gonna do?" And I hand the kid my watch, and boom,
got you.
And gone, right?
But your parents took it a little bit more serious than that. They were like, let's get him. Let's
get him out of here.
Right.
And the school strike was taking place. So it wasn't clear that there was going to be school in September in the New York City public schools.
Right.
And the schools were beginning to implode. The tensions between the decline in the public education and tensions between the school board and the Black community. Now, the school board was actually predominantly Jewish. So you have a predominantly Jewish school board and president of the school board who's Jewish, and predominantly Black communities that feel they don't have control over the schools in their neighborhoods. So it leads to a major meltdown in politics in New York City in 68. So in a sense, she was just pulling me out of the melee and sticking me in this other environment that it was safer. But to be quite frank, I was a leading kid in 2nd grade. I was a top kid in my public school. When I got to 3rd grade in private school, I was the last kid in class. That was the thing that shocked me, to be quite frank. That they had been exposed to stuff I hadn't been exposed to yet. So they were learning division, for instance, in 3rd grade. I had never seen division yet.
Gotcha.
And so I could already, later on in looking back, I could already see well, this is the game of education everybody's talking about.
Right,
How,
right,
certain resources are in certain schools and not in other schools. And so really from that point on, I really recognized how important it was that my mother moved me to this prep school.
right,
Because now I was getting, the quality education that your typical middle-class white kid was getting,
right,
as
right,
opposed to the typical education that your typical poor ghetto kid was getting.
right.
Which
I've noticed that. I noticed that myself when I went to a HBCU for about a year and a half, 2 years. Yeah, yeah, and supposed to taking a microbiology class in the summer at a public university. It was like a yeah,
night and day,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
And everything from the skill set they have in the
yeah.
classroom to the social
Systemic.
capital they
Yeah,
have, how to interact with their professors.
right,
All of that is different.
right.
And so I grew up in a somewhat privileged world, you might say,
Gotcha.
and a somewhat protected world because,
Gotcha.
while the
Although you lived in from the called Mecca of
well, I was in Harlem, I was in
yeah,
Sugar Hill,
yeah,
but as middle class parents, my
right,
parents wouldn't let me play it in the street.
right.
I didn't
Definitely.
get to kind of get away from my parents probably till fifth or sixth grade,
Gotcha.
when in part because I'm going to school with these middle class white kids, my parents allow me more freedom because that
Gotcha.
freedom is being experienced in much more white neighborhoods and
Gotcha.
middle class and safe neighborhoods, right?
Gotcha.
Um, but the streets of Harlem in 1974, 73, that's when the city, the community is on decline.
Right.
That's when New York City is going through a recession. That's when mugging becomes a term people learn in the rest of the nation. It
Right.
was a New York term back then.
Right. Right. Right.
And,
No, I remember I've heard you talk about your nanny was a big influence on you as well,
well,
growing
it's
up.
funny. My mother went back to work when I hit about 2 years old, and my parents hired a nanny named Cora Granberry. Cora Granberry, I wish I had the questions that I have now for her,
Right.
but
That's
I don't know
how
if
it
she was
is.
West Indian.
Hindsight.
I don't know if she was born in the South. I really don't know where her family came from,
Right.
but
Right.
she was a Black woman who was big in the Seventh-day Adventist church. She was a matron in her church. Um, and so literally from a very young age, I learned to pray at noontime. I learned to
But
say
before you go further on that one, your parents, because I didn't hear you so much. Both of your parents what were their religious?
So both my parents being social workers. So dad's a parole officer working in the South Bronx. Mom, as I said, was the Department of Mental Hygiene. We grew up in what I would call a pretty secular household.
Gotcha.
There was no conversation about Jesus. There was a Bible in the bookcase, but it never got pulled out.
Right.
Uh, Christmas was completely secular. It was about Santa Claus and presents.
Right. Right.
There's no conversation about Jesus. But of
Right.
course, that was different with grandma
Right.
because my mother's mother,
Right.
I believe was
Same here.
Baptist.
Right. Right.
She was like,
Uh,
handed me a little. I remember she gave me a little New Testament Bible. It must have been about 3 inches by
mm,
1 inch. It was one of these things you could put in your pocket. And she was
gotcha.
like, "Read your Bible." Okay, and
Gotcha.
so that was grandma. But my personal growing up, being the youngest of three boys, with a 7 and 10 year gap between me and my brothers, I didn't get exposed to it. But I will say my brothers who grew up in the 50s, both were sent to Presbyterian Sunday school,
Okay.
which
Okay.
I was actually shocked when they told me this. I didn't know this until I was adult, because
Mm,
even as kids, those experiences were not talked about. They didn't make any friends from the
right.
church world. Um, but at the same time, my Seventh-day Adventist nanny is very religious and is
Mm,
teaching me to pray, which I presume my parents know this stuff.
right. Right.
And when I'm 9 years old, my mother decides, because I was one of them little kids who liked to sing in the bathroom, and I'm singing Michael Jackson tunes and
Right. Right.
high little voice back then. And so my mother decided to take me to a choir and try me out. So I end up going to this all-white choir called the Church of the Transfiguration, which was
Mm,
actually a very famous boys' choir. It was known as the Little Church Around the Corner. So
okay.
it was an Episcopal choir. where I was in the choir because a friend of my mother's, who was a jazz pianist who lived in Harlem, his sons were in it.
Okay.
So there were three boys. There were three boys who were brothers. They were in it, and me.
Right.
We were the
Right.
black kids in this choir.
Right.
So for 4 years, I sang in an Episcopal choir, and that actually led me to singing. I was fortunate enough to be able to sing in Carnegie Hall, Philharmonic Hall.
Nice.
I got to sing with Zubin Mehta and some of the big composers of the era. And I sang all the big churches of New York, St. Bartholomew's and all the other churches on Christmas and Easter. And so those were great experiences about culture, great experiences about people. I was very independent at a very young age because at 10 and 11, I'm traveling around with these groups singing. And it was actually right around the times that the Harlem Boys Choir came back into because they had kind of gone out of popularity, so to speak, and they came back into popularity right around this time. And I remember at that point wondering, well, how come I'm in this choir and not in the Harlem choir? But it was all too late then. My trajectory was already made. And I was learning to sing a very Anglican style of singing because that's the style of the Episcopal Church. So needless to say, with all this religion I was exposed to, I learned quite a bit about Christianity through all of the experiences I had. I taught the vacation Sunday school for the Seventh-day Adventists during the summers. So I did that, I think, for 2 different summers up in Massachusetts. After my nanny had moved and stopped working for us, I used to go and stay with her during the summers to get out of New York City.
Nice.
So every time I did that, I was in a completely very orthodox Seventh-day Adventist. You couldn't play on the weekends. When the ice cream man came on Saturday, you couldn't get ice cream. They kept an Old Testament biblical practice, so they were the Sabbath keepers, so to speak, and so they did sundown to sunset from Friday to Saturday, just like Orthodox Jews do. So later, when I'm studying a little bit about Judaism and learning about Judaism, it was fascinating for me to understand, okay, some of the things that the Jews are doing, it seems like the Seventh-day Adventists were doing. But then there are other things that the Episcopalians were doing that neither of these groups were doing. And so I started, in learning about Judaism and history, one certainly has to understand its relationship to emerging Christianity and to Islam. And, I guess one of the things that becomes most profound in that learning experience is understanding that the Christians are essentially saying that we have recognized the Jewish Messiah, which they're saying is the Christ character. And the Jews of the period are saying, no, that's not the Messiah. The Christ character is not the Messiah. This sends a split that we still exist today between Jews and Christianity.
Speaking of which, could you also get on and talk about the diversity amongst Black Jews, because it's so diverse, as you even put it in your book, and you couldn't even get on all the facets of.
First, I'm going to give you an update. I just saw the release of an initiative called the Jews of Color Initiative. They are a group of Jews of color here in the United States, led by, I believe her name is Ilana Kaufman. And Ms. Kaufman has helped to bring together some scholars from Stanford University, Ari Kelman, and a number of other scholars.
She's Black herself, correct?
Ilana is a Black Jew.
Okay, got you. No, definitely Kaufman is definitely a Jewish name.
She's a Jew. Let me say a Jew of color. I don't know she's Black. I presume she's Black, but she's a Jew of color. And these are all people from different persuasions. Some are Black, some are mixed race, some are Mizrahi Jews, meaning they're coming from North Africa, or some are Sephardic, coming from Spain, and so and not all, of course, Sephardic people identify as a Jew of color. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying these people do, and they are becoming to get together collectively and
Gotcha.
to push the Jewish community, the mainstream Jewish community, both for recognition and for more cultural openness, I guess I'd say, is the way to frame it. And because of, in Judaism here in the United States, you have a sort of Ashkenaz hegemony, so to speak.
Definitely. When I was living in Florida before I moved to Norway, I remember the area Aventura. Definitely a heavy Jewish community there, and I'm
And
sure
that's true even
in
the way
Harlem, Brooklyn. Yeah.
Oh, precisely, right? The
Right.
Yemenites in Brooklyn, but even when we talk about Jewish history, we tend to start in the 19th century
Mm.
with the Southern and Eastern European Jews who are coming from Europe, and that's how we tell the Jewish story, as opposed to talking about those who were fleeing Spain and wound up in the Caribbean and got caught up in the slave trade
Right.
and created some offspring, and things got a little
Right.
more complicated than the story and the
Right.
narrative that we usually like to
Right.
tell.
And I even, because I only knew, when I was young, I only knew about the Ashkenazi type.
And
And
as
then
a
I
kid,
start
that's
to
all I knew as
right,
well.
right.
You know,
And then
guys with thick
I
Yiddish
started
accents.
right, right. And then I started to hear some word Khazar or something like that through some, maybe you can explain what that is. And then later on, of course, the Sephardic, and then some of the other groups, and also the
Okay, so
Falashas, and then even some Limba and some
here's
other,
the complicated aspect about
right.
Jewish history,
And I swear it's one of the most complex.
which, I
Yeah.
think is challenging because it's like looking at a moving target. So, for instance, if you go before the 19th century, Jews didn't refer to themselves as Jews. Jews refer to themselves as Israel or as Hebrews.
Right.
And so even the notion of the idea of the term Jew as the main descriptor is not consistent across time and place. So that's a problem.
Correct. Correct.
But
As,
beyond that, once I guess I'd have to situate it in the destruction of the Second Temple. Once the Second Temple is destroyed, once the tribes are split up and dispersed, now you have different groups who claim to be the descendants of Abraham, because that's really the key. Not
correct.
who's the Jew
Right.
so much, because that's just a label, you might say.
Right. Right.
It's so much who's claiming this mantle of a particular descent from Abraham and the meaning behind that, and the relationship that relationship creates between his people and God.
And that at that point, you were talking about the second destruction of the temple. That's when they talk about how that's when it's instead of being a temple based religion to be more of a book based or
Precisely,
right.
precisely.
Gotcha.
And I was actually just reading today that it was because of certain laws within the lands in which they were living that helped lead to a kind of literary culture, so to speak. So it was coming together both of the ability to read and the training to read with a new orientation of sort of the holiness was shifting from place to the book itself, if you think,
Right.
in a way in which the Jewish community holds reverence for the Torah is a sort of a substitute for the Holy Temple, you might say. Or at least that's how I've come to understand it. And let me say,
Right.
these are my interpretations.
Right. No, I got you.
There may be Jewish scholars and rabbinic experts that will say, no, he got that completely
Right.
wrong.
But let's go back to that. So
I'm sorry. So when we're talking about Ashkenazis and Jews, we're talking about rabbinic Judaism, a particular strain of Judaism that you can trace back.
Right.
And so you might say the era of the Pharisees give way to a new era of the rabbis. And that's that shift in leadership within the Jewish community, that shift in authority within the Jewish community is reflective of how Judaism developed in its first few hundred years in diaspora. And that's where you begin to get the Talmud and Mishnah and
rabbinic
texts that go along with the Tanakh itself to interpret.
Right. And I'm mainly referring to the distinction between the Sephardic and the other major groups. What are the other major groups that are?
Well, these are all kind of, different times in history.
Right.
You'll see that different names have been referred to different groups.
Right.
And so sometimes they were regionally referred to.
Right.
Of course, the term Jew comes from Judea, which was in fact a regional term in its origin.
Right.
So not everyone in Judea was a Jew.
Right.
But Jews dominated Judea, right?
Right.
And so this tension over place and people.
What was this that word I just threw out earlier? Khazar. I remember hearing some. I don't know some.
Now the Khazars are not a group
and I know it's
studied, but I do know this is the group that broke off early in the trajectory of early Judaism, just like the Karaites did.
Right.
And these are groups that still claim descent from Abraham. So in a sense, they still claim to be connected to the ancient Israelites, which in a sense, that's what modern day Jews are saying. Because remember, the ancient Israelites didn't call themselves Jews. They call themselves the ancient Israelites. They call themselves the Israelites, right? Or the Hebrews. And so that's why I say the terminology itself is quite fascinating as one gets into the nitty gritty. So for example, when I was trying to understand Jews in Ethiopia, I started learning that there are official narratives about the evolution of Christianity in Ethiopia and the role of a group referred to as the Ehud, A-Y, I think it's A-Y-H-U-D, I believe that's how it's spelled. And that is, according to the historians, they believe that this is the original Jewish group in Ethiopia in the 4th century. They identified this group. And at the same time, scholars say, well, but we're not sure if they're all descended of Jews or if they're Jewish converts or if they're mixed, quote, ancestral Jews with other Africans. We don't know.
Right.
And they end up describing, they end up concluding without much factual basis that they're probably not real Jews. And therefore, they are a kind of ethnic minority that refuses to take on Christianity when Ethiopia becomes a Christian state. And so they place the origin of the Ehud not back in being descended from Abraham, but as a response to the political turmoil taking place within 4th century Ethiopia. And they say, well, but we don't think they're real Jews. Now, I came along and read this historical narrative and said, well, how do they jump from this sketchy bit of evidence to conclude that they're not really Jews? When in fact, there was
I hear you mention that
widespread
about
evidence
how historians sometimes tend to, as you're doing research on this book, that you notice that how historians can make a lot of conjecture on so little evidence.
Oh, precisely. Whether it's the absence of evidence, drawing that somehow the absence of evidence is evidence, and so that's not always the case.
Right.
And so one, just like looking at the history of the descendants of Jews in the Caribbean, where you have circumstances where some Black folks decided one morning that, hey, I'm going to be Jewish. And then other Black folks are truly descended because, their granddaddy was a Jew.
Right.
And sort of sorting out those individual histories become extremely complicated to know, which individual is telling the truth. That's more difficult to determine than understanding whether or not particular processes were likely to take place. So were we likely to have seen Jewish offspring who took on their ancestral identities as Jews, well, that possibility certainly seems equally strong as it is for some folks to wake up one morning and decide that they're Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a lot of evidence for either. And in
Right,
fact,
right.
what the evidence does tend to show is that there was a lot of race mixing and there was a lot of wholesale conversion, particularly in places like Suriname, where we see a very well documented mixed race Jewish community descended from Sephardic Jews and the Africans that they had enslaved. And part of, for me, when you look at historically over time, the great conundrum for Jews is that Jews are persecuted as religious others in Europe and are fleeing Europe and become middlemen in an expanding colonialist slave trade, where in order for them to engage in their religious freedom, they have to enslave somebody else. So the contradictions of that,
Right,
as
right.
well as the contradictions of
No.
creating mixed race offspring that were
Right.
recognized as part of their broader religious community. These to me are sort of some of the most interesting contradictions of
Right, right.
the way in which race has flowed through history.
And their engagement in adopting whiteness and later on and all these things like that. I would
And
like
having
to.
to distance themselves from those Africans.
Right, right, right.
Right? Because remember, in the late 19th century, there was a rich discourse called ethnology, where scholars were running around trying to determine if Jews were mixed with Africans or not.
Right, right.
There's speculation that Jews were somehow a mongrel race, and
right, right.
and that was somehow reflected of their African, either mixing with Africans or their African origins. Either one was put forth.
Right. And
So
we'll
in a sense, we're saying Jews were really black people.
Right, right.
And Jews or Ashkenazi Jews responded by saying, well, no, we're not a race, we're an ethnic group, we're plural. We can be two things at once. We can be Jewish and American. To be Jewish doesn't mean we can't be American.
Right, right.
The racial framework says to be Jewish is a permanent, everlasting thing, and you can't become part of our body politic. So we were really talking about whether or not Jews could become part of these new emerging nation states from the 18th and 19th century, as laws across Europe enfranchised Jews after they had been disenfranchised for centuries. Oh, I think you froze on me. I don't know if you're there or not. I'm going to wait. Says live on YouTube. All right, I'm going to leave and come back.
I am with Dr. Bruce D. Haynes. He will be coming back. This is going to be a late one today. I think this is actually not my latest interview. If you go back to, I interviewed about the author of Yasuke Samurai Warrior. That was my latest interview that I've done, but this is probably my second latest interview that I've done. Let me see. I think he's back in full effect. We'll see. There you go.
Back.
Yeah. No, I was about to ask about your, and we'll get into that later. I want to ask about your formative years. Who were some of your biggest influences?
Wow.
I know that's probably a huge question.
Influences. When I was young, I used to talk about MLK a lot.
Right.
I was kind of being.
And you won some sort of award with Martin Luther King. I forgot to mention.
Oh, that was a diversity award. That's sort of
kind
of an educator's award.
Gotcha.
I work on diversity issues and have been since my entire career. I study race and ethnic inequality.
Right.
So it's natural for me to, in a sense, become an advocate for everybody. So, whether you're Native American or Asian American or mixed race or Black and now, of course, we've got, women, trans, queer, and a lot of
Right.
other folks who
Right.
have to
Right.
be included in thinking about diversity in these
Right.
institutions.
Right. Right.
I'm an equal rights defender of people's rights.
Got you. Got you. And so your influence as far as well, let's say this book because that's a huge you can go anywhere with it. But
Well, one of
and I
my
want to
influences, I'm
this
going to
book to
say,
social Judaism. Yeah.
I'm going to put it out there. One of my major influences, my first mentor, who's this
Okay.
Jewish guy named Jay Schulman.
Okay.
Um, Jay Schulman picked the jury for the Chicago 7.
Got you.
When they
Yeah, I
did
heard.
that movie, I wish they didn't have a character representing my mentor, Jay Schulman. Jay
Got you.
Schulman defended Dr. Spock. He defended registration card burners. He defended the Chicago 7. He just defended Kathy Boudin and the Weather Underground.
Okay.
And he defended William Westmoreland, who was a general in the Tet Offensive. And so when I came out of undergraduate, I was very limited to the kinds of jobs I could get as a Black man, and ended up working for a transportation company in New York City. And by coincidence, I met Jay Schulman, who was picking juries in New York. Jay hired me, and my first case, I was working on the Brinks robbery, helping to select a jury in Westchester County for Kathy Boudin's trial. And so Jay taught me social science skills. He taught me research skills. I worked with him for 2 or 3 years. And afterwards he said, okay, you can't work for me forever. You need your own PhD. So he coordinated with some of his friends at CUNY Graduate Center, where I went there and took a 1-year course in research methods as a non-matriculated student. And it was a course on research methodology. I aced the course, and that's how I got into graduate school.
Wow.
And so it was a kind of interesting process by which I got into graduate school. And I've been told by a number of pretty knowledgeable people that the reason that I got into graduate school that way, because back in the 1980s, people were still under the belief that Black folks wouldn't do very well on the GREs. So despite my private school background, the folks who wanted to get me into CUNY decided to waive the GRE because they didn't think I'd do very well on it. And so I learned later that might have been a bit of,
affirmative action.
Well, more like liberal racism.
No, I got you. Yeah.
Back alley racism, so to speak.
Right.
But that was a lesson. CUNY was a great place for me. I got really well trained there, and I landed my first job at Yale University.
Wow.
And so, had it not been for Jay.
How was that experience at Yale? Was that you're at the big Ivy League
Yale
school?
is a fascinating place.
Did it humble you, or was it?
Well, it humbles you in the sense that you think everybody's brilliant when you get there, and you think everybody's a Nobel laureate, and then you realize that there are people that some of the most brilliant people you meet can't tie their shoes, and some of the people who claim to be brilliant really ain't so smart. And so there's a lot of demystifying that happened.
Right.
And I had a couple of scholars, one by the name of Kai Erickson.
Right.
A major figure. He wrote a very famous book called Everything in Its Path, about coal mining towns being wiped out by flooding. And so he was one of the first people to write about disasters back in the 1970s. So this gentleman took me under his wing, gave me some tips on how to write a book, and then wrote the preface to my very first book called Red Lines, Black Spaces, about race in the suburbs.
Got you.
So individuals like Kai were really important because there are lots of other experiences that I won't go into any detail that made it a very harsh place to be, particularly for a young Black person.
Tell me about it.
It was a place that was well resourced, yet one of the most disappointing things seeing there was understanding that getting access to the social networks that Yale provided was equally as important as the education that they're getting in the classroom. And that most of my minority students, very few were able to break into those networks despite getting a Yale degree.
Right.
And that distinction between, well, have a piece of paper and it getting you somewhere, as opposed to having a bunch of friends who got businesses and jobs and getting you somewhere, it's a whole other world.
Right.
And so even there was a sort of sorting out of sort of, say, the visitors in this elite world from the folks who ran it, from the folks who were running, was it Skull and Bones, I believe was the name of one of the secret societies up there.
Right.
And so those folks, that world of presidents emerged from, they don't have any Black folks in their networks. And that was telling.
Right.
It made me understand both what we could achieve and at the same time the boundaries by which we were excluded from access to certain centers of power and wealth in America.
Right. And then you end up at UC Davis, which is not a place to sneeze at, you know.
I was happy to come to UC Davis after
definitely.
I wanted to go to a public institution. I wanted to go to a place where decisions were made in a public way, as opposed to in a capricious way, because private universities can do what they want. So Yale could give raises to whomever it wanted. It could do what it wanted essentially without much accountability. I like the fact that I'm in a system that is accountable. I'm accountable to my peers. My peers are accountable to me. There's promotions. So no one's getting a pass here in the way that favoritism works within those private institutions. And so, yeah, the Davis was a good move for me. I've been well supported here. I've been here 20 years now.
Yeah, I didn't realize you were there that long. Until I researched. Right.
Okay, this is when I knew I was old. When 2 years ago, I taught the daughter of one of my former students.
Okay.
That's when I knew I was getting old.
Wow. Got you. So yeah, so you said your influence. He sent you on a, as you said, trajectory.
He opened doors because he encouraged me to get that piece of paper, to get that doctorate. And that doctorate is what opened up doors to Yale.
Right. And who would you say is the influence on kind of how you see the world today? And
wow, there've been so many intellectual influences. I mean, Du Bois, as someone who I return to time and time again, because of the both psychological insights as well as the sociological and political insights he has. He made connections that we're still reconnecting or rediscovering all the time, whether it's about intersectionality or the global nature of racial inequality.
Right. Have you got into some of Dr. Amos Wilson's?
No, I don't know his work.
Okay. He's I forgot how many years ago he passed away. But he has, I guess some would say, a little bit more of a radical approach. But Dr. Amos Wilson is a bunch of videos on YouTube. Psychologist, falsification of. He has so many books and so many works out there. But yeah, you have to. I guess you haven't heard of him. We won't go there for now. But
one of the things I've learned in academia is that we're all trying to describe the things that we see, that we observe.
Right.
And we're often trying to come up with the right term or the right metaphor to capture that thing we're observing. And if we are good at it, then we can help people see things with fresh eyes.
Right.
And so it's not always necessarily new ideas, because sometimes I see people are working very well parallel on a lot of different issues. But somebody figures out the right way to frame the conversation, and that becomes the one that everybody wants to read. And so language, I realize, is very important. One of the things I'm very proud of with this book is it took 20 years to write this book. I was writing this book when I arrived at UC Davis in 2001.
Wow.
Writing this book. I started in 1998. And my research was completed. The empirical part was all done by 2003 or so. But it took me a number of years to make sense of the interviews, to dig, to ask enough questions, to get enough information, and to find the language that allowed me to talk about race without reifying race. Right, which is the conundrum, right? Because we say, well, race isn't real, but then we use the terms and now it makes it real. And so how do we get around this kind of chicken and egg problem? And so I was very meticulous in thinking about.
I realized that I realized that in the book and how it was written, very well written. I say, yeah.
And that's why I don't have, the publisher wanted me to call it something about Black Jews. And I said to the publisher, I spent an awful lot of time not writing race into any of the sentences in this book. Why would I want to reify race in the title? Because part of what the book does, I believe, is raise questions about the way in which racial classification works to dehumanize people. And I'm looking and showing that it didn't just start with Africans, that maybe the conversation about Jews and the Jewish body is as much part of this conversation about race as Black people. And here's where I'll draw bring those two ideas home. That's clearly how the Nazis saw it, because the Nazis believed in what they refer to as racial degeneracy. And if you look at their imagery of Jews during the Nazi era, they were Africanizing Jews. They were turning them into caricatured Africans, and in fact, making Jews look like Black people. And so, if you think about it, the connection to the Nazi philosophy is that Jewish degeneration is, in a sense, Jews are reverting back to their truer selves, which is a sense of their Black selves. And that theme has reoccurred over and over throughout Western discourses about Jews.
When were you first aware of the Black and Jewish relationship? When did you first?
Well, I grew up in the civil rights era, right? And I grew up in New York City. New York City is the place that has lots of Jews. New York is a place that has lots of Black folks. So the Black community is very empowered there, and so is the Jewish community. So very much in the 60s, when you looked at who was more likely to engage in civil rights, it's not a coincidence that the gentlemen who were killed down south were named Schwerner and Schwartz, along with Mr. Cheney. Right? And so that's not a coincidence. That's reflective of the deep involvement of Jewish Americans in the civil rights movement. And so during the early 70s, when I'm a 12-year-old, Blacks and Jews involved in labor organizing in New York, Blacks and Jews involved in progressive politics on the left in New York. So it was in those contexts that I had always seen a connection. And then, of course, as you get older, you learn about, the NAACP and their involvement with, say, the Brown case. And you begin to see that more than any other identifiable group of white folks, Jews have been involved with Black causes for equality.
And I guess what I meant to say was, when was the point where you wanted to emphasize and pretty much write this book about the
well, that's a great question. I first got interested in the topic in the early 90s.
Or focus on this,
I wrote a piece with a scholar named Phil Kazanitz down at CUNY Grad Center, and it was about Jewish conflict taking place in central Harlem between a South African immigrant who owned a record store and a Syrian Jewish immigrant who was subleasing to this record store owner. And the media framed this as a Black Jewish conflict.
At the fashion mart, as you
Exactly, at the
got
fashion
right.
mart.
Got you.
But Phil Kasnitz and I questioned the framing of that as a Black Jewish conflict, because traditionally the Black Jewish conflict was between Southern Black migrants with a few West Indians thrown in and Ashkenazi Jews.
Right.
Well, now we had a South African Black guy and a Syrian Jew. And
right,
so
right.
we were framing this as a Black Jewish conflict as if it was just the same old trope. So we problematized that and pointed out
that was different than the Crown Heights. The Crown Heights was an Ashkenazi and a Black, I guess, right?
Precisely.
Right.
Crown Heights was similar but different in that it was a now largely Caribbean working class Black community as opposed to a Southern-born Black Black community.
Right.
But the tensions between what was a motorcade of a rabbi's motorcade came through this neighborhood and apparently struck a child and killed them. And that led to a controversy, not just about the motorcade, but also about the medical team. There was some particular Jewish medical service that responded, and there was rumor that the driver was taken away, but not the child that was hit.
Right,
and so that added to what was perceived as the injustice of the circumstances. But that also led to the death of a young man named, I want to say Yaakov Rosenbaum. I might get his name wrong, but there was a young Hasidic student who just got attacked out of the blue after this incident because somebody felt they needed to retaliate against Jews.
Right. So would you say that these
innocent folks, Gavin Cato, innocent.
Right.
Mr. Rosenbaum, innocent. But violence between groups kills, of course, the innocents, not the people who tend to yell at each other.
Right. So would you say because of these conflicts and also your own life experiences going to a majority Jewish school? I mean, weren't you a convert yourself?
No, so I'm not Jewish, and I never converted.
Okay.
But what was taking place?
Because I heard you speak about Judaism, whatever, but I never actually heard like a Garfield or anybody ask you certain particular questions. Were you Jewish, or were your parents Jewish, or anything like
no,
that?
It's funny. A lot of people presume I'm
they presume a lot. That's why I'm kind of asking you.
I think so.
Directly some of these things that yeah. So but even though you're not a converted Jew, you did say that you went to a majority, predominantly white Jewish school per se.
But it was just happened to be dominated by Jews. I mean, sort of like Dalton and New York Friends and a bunch of private schools in New York were dominated by Jewish kids.
Right. And so I'm trying to get on what kind of got you into focusing on and say, I want to kind of.
Well, I've always had Jewish friends
on this book in particular. Yeah.
But I think the preoccupation is really more theoretically driven, quite honestly. I became preoccupied with understanding. You might say, why were people preoccupied with the Black Jewish conversation in the first place?
Right.
Like, that's kind of what I wanted to get at the heart of. Right. People have been talking about this Black and Jewish thing. They don't talk about Blacks and Italians or Blacks and the Irish. Right. Jews. So
right.
Well, what's
up? I mean, don't get me wrong. I get it. I personally get it. But I'm that's audience to people listening to or whatnot. Yeah.
Well, what's up with that? And I started thinking, well, Jews were ostracized in Europe and Blacks were ostracized here. And you go back and forth and you see these parallels about inequality between the two groups.
Definitely. And then also, like you put in the book, me growing up to, with a Christian family, they relate to the Jewish, their expulsion and their, all kinds of stuff.
The Black Saga identifies with the Israelite saga.
Right.
We are looking for the promised land. Right. That story links us in a very strong way.
Right.
And you might say that European Jews who saw themselves as the persecuted folks, right? It was them and the Roma folks in Europe. They came here and saw us as persecuted as they get their rights. And so I do think there is a particularly uniquely Jewish consciousness about inequality that's invoked by the Jewish narrative. And I think it's unavoidable because remember, every year Jews have a Passover and retell the story that we too were once slaves in Egypt. And the whole Passover story is about the fact that, you can recline now because you're free and drink lots of wine because you celebrate that you're free. And your obligation, of course, is to ensure that others are free. That is a unique obligation, I believe, in the religious world, that they are compelled to bring that same freedom to other people. You might say it's those kinds of values that drew me personally to the religion as I'm learning to study it in a more objectified way.
At the same time, I've had Jews when I talked about slavery and racism and things like that. I've had Jews, one in particular from Brooklyn, New York, tell me something about how, they were kind of tired of the slavery talk amongst blacks and reminding people that they've been through slavery too and through the ancient times according to the biblical story, of course.
No, but it's great. You touch on something that I didn't touch on today. It gets complicated, but that has to do with the role of the Nation of Islam in the conversation between blacks and Jews politically, and particularly in the public sphere. In 1992, Conrad Muhammad, who's one of Farrakhan's more vocal and flamboyant ministers, gives a number of speeches that has a lot of anti-Semitic stuff in it. He moves from the sort of like Farrakhan's words have often been questionable. These were indisputably
You're talking about Khalid Muhammad?
Khalid Muhammad.
Right. Gotcha.
So his experience at King College, that combined with the publication of The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, which is a document produced by the research arm of the Nation of Islam. It is a deeply problematic document as a piece of research. And the reason is it's a kind of cherry picking selection of history. So it goes to look for something and it finds what it looks for. Well, it goes to find Jews and related to the slave trade, and it finds every Jewish surname they could potentially connect to the slave trade, and they write it down and document it and put it in a book and say, there you go, they're all the Jews.
But at the same time,
we could do that with the Irish.
We
could do that with any group.
I
mean, that doesn't make them the dominant just because you put a book together. See, they're all the Irish.
True.
That's what we do with the Jews. Okay. So it's that uniqueness, and that's often where, when we start talking about questions of anti-Semitism, distinction between criticism of Jews versus a kind of blind indictment of Jews for being Jews. That's the line. That's the line right there.
Definitely. I agree with you. Yeah.
And so I think Farrakhan crossed that line at times. Conrad Muhammad crossed it quite often. And those conversations led to a whole backlash by Jewish scholars. Actually, it's quite fascinating. If you look at the conversation that takes place in the 1990s, between Jewish scholars who are historians who feel they need, as Jews, to respond to this accusation that Jews are, quote, responsible for the slave trade. And so a number of major scholars write a number of pieces giving great documentations about Jews and the slave trade. And, the bottom line is Jews acted like white folks. So when Jews were here, they engaged in the slave trade just like everybody else. And in fact, when they documented, they engaged in the slave trade reflective of their proportion in society. So it's not as if they're overrepresented in the slave trade. They just happen to become slave traders just like the rest of European society. So it was a unique indictment of Jews. And to be quite frank, it defies the conversation that I'm actually writing about right now, which is the way in which ideas about Jews and Africans have been intertwined in the Western world for 500 years. And so what I'm doing right now is trying to show how, as we move to racialize Jews and move them from an idea that Jews were sort of this Orientalized group to the idea that Jews were a real racial group in the 18th century, we begin to let's sort of put it now. We begin to reframe the narrative of anti-Semitism away from its roots in religion, that Jews were originally considered to be Christ killers, to this notion that the Jewish body itself is polluted, to the idea that Jews themselves are a race that might be mixed with Africans. And so as Jews are being racialized in the 18th century by Lamarckian scientists who are saying that Jews are unique because of environment, and environment gets embedded within the Jewish body, it's the same time that we are constructing new ideas about difference. And those ideas about difference of the Jewish body very quickly overlaps with our conversations about those Africans. And so we're talking about the Africans as subhuman and as primitive and as savage. And then we say, well, the Jews, they must be mixed with them. And so you might say we Africanize the Jews. Tudor Parfit has this awesome book. Do I have it here? Oh, I don't have it here. It is called I can't remember the title of it. It is a book that looks at the intersection of what he calls anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism. And he says they're intertwined in history. And he traces some of this through. The thing that he misses in that conversation is that it's not just the mixing of Africans and Jews, where you're kind of, you mix them up as if they're equal parts. The conversation is very clear that Jews are somehow smart, but they're sneaky, they're devious, they're evil. Blacks are subhuman. And so there's a very distinct conversation taking place that people are not recognizing in the way the conflation of Jews and Blackness works. So in other words, we Africanize the Jews. We don't Judaize the Africans, right? We don't make the African Jews. We make the Jews Black. That unidirectional focus is what Tudor Parfit misses, because it's that unidirectional focus that I argue places Jews within this essential place in the way in which white Christianity comes to define itself in opposition to who? The Africans and the Jews. And it's that definition that places Christianity and a white conception of the body politic at the center. It's that politic that places Blacks and Jews in conversation across 500 years of colonial history. That making any sense? Or am I
got you.
Talking out my ass. I'm sorry.
No, I got you. I got you.
It's that's the stuff I think is most important. Trying to show how segregation, capitalism, racialization are intertwined as projects that are interrelated. And they're interrelated in both subordinating Blacks and Jews to particular roles within the capitalist economy, and it relegates their personhood to a unique relationship to whiteness and Christianity. And Jews are sort of half in and half out.
Right.
Blacks are just out.
No doubt about that. I want to get into when you mentioned in an interview about Afrocentrism. What's your view on Afrocentrism? You also defended it in a way when you said that you read Clarence Walker's book called Can't Go Home Again, and how dismissive he was about certain elements of it. But before you get into that, what's your view on the
Afrocentrism? Here's the issue for me. How I think about disciplines,
right,
is that particularly in the sciences, which is what I think of myself as a social scientist, what makes me different from other social scientists,
or Dr. Philosophy, I've
well, exactly. And so for me, it's about the empirical, right? It's about doing the study.
You can take a drink of water if you want to, by the way.
So when I look at Afrocentrism, and it says that you need to place African values and African people at the center of any analysis, yada, 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 I'm like, well, what else is new? If I'm a good ethnographer, that's what I do. In approaching the Hebrew Israelite community in my book here, you'll notice I go to great pains never to pass judgment on who is, quote, a real Jew or not.
Yeah, I definitely noticed. I noticed that.
That's a part, because that's a question I can't answer.
Right.
You see, that's a question that a scientist can't answer.
And be devil's advocate. To be devil's advocate, though, is also a way to sell more books.
Precisely.
To get a wider audience.
That's why, people.
Let's keep it a buck now.
Most of the books that were written said, well,
you were very careful in your, like I said, well written. You're a very articulate brother. One of probably the most articulate brother I've interviewed so far. But definitely.
But words are powerful. Words are powerful.
Absolutely.
And so when we use, so for me, okay. Let me start here. What is race? Race is a system of categorization or classification.
Right.
And based on that, it gives you rights or not rights.
Right.
And seeing race in that way makes it a political thing as opposed to an objective thing. So unlike, say, the negritude poets who argue for essential Blackness, right? I'm suggesting that Blackness is a modern conception based in racial ideas. And that even the notion of the unity of Africa is a somewhat modern conception. You go back a couple hundred years and the Africans didn't have any unity of the continent. Right? I mean, you got 5,000 languages. What kind of unity are we talking about here? And so to me, race is about an imposed classificatory system, not about color. Because how else do you get a Walter White, head of the NAACP, who looks white, but who can pass? I mean, but who is Black, but can pass, right? So how do you get, super light-skinned Black folks? Well, the only way you can do that is with a asymmetrical system. And so whiteness is a protected category and Blackness is the junk category. You toss everything into that and then they're closed out. That's how you get the rainbow of Black folks. Whereas you keep whiteness, quote, in theory, pure. Right? This is why everybody freaked out when Rachel Dolezal passed.
There you go.
And she didn't bother me. You know what? She didn't bother me at all, because if she wanted to walk the walk and fight the fight, let her do it. Great. But folks were upset because she was somehow stealing something
Right.
Because I think part of it was more that we were upset of
Mm.
the notion that you could have all these white people who become black.
Right. Right.
I mean, which is ironic because, of course, the protected category is the white category. That's the one that everybody's protecting. That's the one with the privilege. And
Right.
so
Right.
the idea that we have always accepted black passing as a sort of fact of American life, but now this one white girl does it and we all lost our minds. That
Right.
cracked
Right.
me up
Right.
because it
Right.
just shows the asymmetry of the relationship about the
Mm.
categories. They're not
Right.
one category signifies debasement, another category signifies honor.
Right.
It's
Right.
very different.
Right. Right.
So, for me, treating race that way allows us to see the ways in which it can be manipulated politically, the ways in which it overlaps with other kinds of inequalities like class or gender. So if we got rid of racial inequality tomorrow for all black folks on the planet, well, if you're poor and black, you still be poor and black tomorrow.
Right. No doubt about that.
Getting rid of
Right.
racism won't get rid of all the problems, right?
Nah. Nah.
It's only one
Right.
dimension
Right.
of a number of layers of inhumanity to human beings that we engage in.
Right. Right.
You might argue that women get the worst deal on the planet, not black folks.
Right. Yeah. Some say that. Um. So, in your defense of Afrocentrism, you had mentioned like I said, going back to Clarence Walker's work, you said how he dismissed certain elements of Black culture.
Yes, so it's not
About the holding on
Afrocentrism.
and rekindling traditions and
Exactly.
right.
See, so here I distinguish between what people refer to as Afrocentrism from how would I frame it?
And then you also you talk about the untrained scholars and
Well, see, here's our
use of
distinction. So here's what I'm trying to describe.
right.
Within Black culture, there is a rich body of an anti-racist discourse that's embedded in folk music, embedded in the spirituals, embedded
Right.
in the trickster tales, embedded in, and it's that wellspring of culture that provides sort of cultural cohesion for Black Americans, right? And that stuff is framed through Du Bois and the Harlem Renaissance and Langston Hughes and the Temptations and all of that cultural stuff.
Now, in reference, when I'm talking about, in reference to like the Hebrew Israelites and things and things like that, some of the more radical, and I'm trying to.
Some of the more radical Hebrew Israelites make an essentialist argument about race.
Right.
So they want to say that the Black category is a sort of essential category.
Right.
But again, I don't think that fits history.
Right.
The problem with that, it doesn't.
No, but at the same time, are you? What I'm trying to get at is I've heard you say that you don't necessarily dismiss, like you said, how you've written the book, not trying to dismiss some of the things they say, even if they're not historically accurate or
well, what you have to do
couldn't be proven untrue. But what I'm saying is, what I'm trying to gather, I heard you talk about it. Are you saying that certain groups, I mean, they're not getting it from nowhere. They're not.
No. In fact, no.
It's not a total reach. It's not a total connection with Judy, like Hebrew Israelites. And
you see, the problem is that that's
that.
a complicated.
It's not a total made up or reinvention, as you put it. It's
I think it can be both.
Right.
I think it can be both. I think to say that one person or one family has legit ancestry and can make the certain kind of ancestral claim is different from saying everybody fits.
Right, right.
And so, the challenge was twofold. For those Afro-Americans and Afro-Caribbeans who have true descent from Ashkenazis or Sephardic Jews in the Caribbean, the question becomes, can they lay claim to their Jewish ancestry just like American Ashkenazi Jews who may skip a generation in their Jewish practice and choose to return to being a Jew?
Right, right.
To me, that's where the inconsistency is. So with the white Jew, we say, well, I know it's patrilineal descent, but that kid's really Jewish. It's okay.
Right.
But with the black person, we say, no, they're really black. They're not Jewish. Their father is not legit. That goes against logic to me.
Right.
Right. And so it's the same with the Ethiopians and the Russians going back to Israel. Okay. When they brought the Ethiopians back, they said, yeah, but you got to prove that you're Jewish and we need to have a big conversation about it. And it took a few years and the rabbis had to rule. And then even after that, we still got to check your blood because we're not sure if you guys got AIDS, right? So all of this should happen.
Right.
That did not happen for the Russian Jews.
Right.
It's that context in one piece I wrote that actually racialized the Ethiopian Jews and made them conscious of their blackness.
Definitely.
Because what was not important to them, blackness in part, was not particularly important in their Ethiopian identity.
Right.
They saw themselves as Jews in Christian Ethiopia, and now they're Jews in Israel, and race gets invoked.
Right.
Right. So to me, that's a fascinating process, and you can see how race became more important to the Ethiopian Jews precisely because their kids were being called Kushi at school or experiencing other kinds of discrimination, and so race was real in their lives,
right,
being real in their consciousness, and so the Israelite dilemma is that you have so many different groups. It's like Christianity. You have a variety of groups that lay claim to terms and identities.
Right.
Not much different than you have in the Christian world.
Right.
And
right.
so, who gets to decide who's the real Christian? Well, you got the same problem over here. Who gets to decide who's the real Jew? And
For sure.
I think most Jews are hesitant to disparage other people who claim to be Jews, unless they feel their practice is so far out of the pale of what's normative for them. So I've seen increasing tolerance for the Hebrew Israelite community today.
Do you believe that is because of their dwindling numbers, or they're because of one side of the coin?
I think you've had more conversation about difference. I think,
Right. No, I mean, I understand that part, but and you've written about that a bit. But also, do you believe because of, you have the whole Middle Eastern world and, pretty much after them. And so they're kind of just like white supremacy, how they're kind of tokenizing these East Asians, as some would say, making them honorary white folk in certain areas because of their dwindling influence, power and numbers or and things like that. So they're just now opening it up to more.
Well, you might say that's true for Judaism writ large. Yeah. That as Jews outmarry, as Jews become less religious with each succeeding generation, that Judaism has gotten.
So you don't think it's a power move though, as well?
I think it's a reasonable response to circumstance, right? So in other words, if you start losing numbers, you're going to do one or two things. You either got to shore up the boundaries to make sure the boundaries are really stark, or you got to loosen up the boundaries so you can bring more folks in. And so you might say Orthodox Jews have shored up the boundaries while Reform Jews are open.
But Judaism is so complex; they're probably doing both. I see
Well,
them
exactly.
doing.
Well, in the form world
Right.
right now, there is this sort of the recognition that the group that I thought was mostly white is much more diverse than I had thought. And
Mm.
many American Jews are going through kind of reconciling their notion of themselves as
Right.
white people and the notion of who Jews are with the reality of these changing demographics.
Yeah.
I just see my computer is going to die in another couple of minutes. So
Okay. Yeah,
I'm
I was gonna wrap this up soon anyway, but damn, only like in 2 minutes or five minutes or so.
yeah, I'm not sure how much time I got. Let me see what I got here as it tells me.
If it's 10 minutes, then
14
we
minutes.
wrap
I
it up.
got 14 minutes, so let's see if it gives me that. It may say that.
14. All right, we'll go quick then. I'll talk fast. So, okay, some of the groups that you had researched in the book was Hebrew Israelites, obviously.
Well, there are all these different
Uh,
groups, right? So
right,
the cherry people and the
right,
crowdy people,
right, right,
and there's Temple Bethel down in Philadelphia.
right, right, right,
There are people who are practicing Israelites who don't belong to any group.
right, right,
And so what I did was interview people from most of those groups and then read extensively. So for instance, I don't have anybody from Dimona, for example, but I
mm,
talk about Benami's group, but I'm
right,
using mostly other people's sources to
right,
fit their conversation into the broader conversation.
mm,
Um, so, my book is not sort of written as a definitive book on Black Jews.
mm,
My book is a stab at trying to sort out who's who in this world of people who refer to themselves as Black Jews,
mm,
and I made it a little bit more complicated from the kind of exoticism that we tend to see Black Jews through.
mm, mm.
Right? So the guys who are standing on a street corner and yelling, those are the ones we tend to put in the newspaper and talk about Black Hebrews.
Right, right. Now, what do you say when some Jews talking about the Judaism is compatible with their blackness, being black, or also you hear the opposite, that Judaism is incompatible of being a black
Um,
person.
I think it's pretty clear that both Islam and Judaism have little concern for race per se, but both are concerned with group boundaries and how they draw those boundaries. And so, really, when it comes to the question of Black Jews, the big question for the Jewish world becomes, where's the boundaries for determining who's a Jew?
Right,
How far do we stretch them?
right, right, right.
And so when people are traditionalists and hold to orthodox understandings of inclusion, then some folks don't count. But that is also true in the Ashkenazi world, is true as well.
Right, right, right.
So that's why I'm saying, well, I'm not sure they're playing the race card, but I do believe that matrilineal descent is allows modern Jews to hide behind the question of Jewish involvement in the Caribbean.
Mm.
And to what degrees are those folks left behind? To what degree can they claim to be Jews as well? I think that's still an unresolved question. But so are but at the end of the day, it's all about boundaries and rule making. Which, when you think about the heart of Judaism, that's kind of what it is. It's following those commandments. It's following the law. It's about what you do, not what you say, not what you think. That's one of the key differences, I think, between Judaism and, say, the Christian world. The Christian world is about faith and belief. The Jewish world is about following the law and practice.
Absolutely. Right. Now, yeah, no, because Yeah, no, if we had more time, I guess we kind of started out slow. I was gonna get into a couple of chapters, like the two drops, chapter 6 and 7, when worlds collide and all that. But we don't have much time, but it's all good. And
Let me say two things. There are folks who across the boundaries.
it's all good. His computer died on us. And it's damn near 2 in the morning. And I still gotta get up in the morning. Um, anyway, I appreciate this brother um coming in talking to me. Maybe we will do a part two at some point in the future. Um, I try to allow him to speak, as some of our previous interviewees I haven't allowed to speak so much. But with that being said, it kind of dragged out late, and it's freaking just damn, it's late. It's almost 2 in the morning. So like, uh, anyway, yeah. If you guys like this interview, please click like. Don't forget to subscribe. I'm gonna continue bringing more interviews at decent times. This won't happen ever again. If I don't have them around in the normal time in the evening, Norwegian time, I just won't do it. I'll reschedule. Anyway, um, please subscribe. I'm out.